Environmental sociology is typically defined as the sociological study of societal-environmental interactions, although this definition immediately presents the problem of integrating human cultures with the rest of the environment. Although the focus of the field is the relationship between society and environment in general, environmental sociologists typically place special emphasis on studying the social factors that cause environmental problems, the societal impacts of those problems, and efforts to solve the problems. In addition, considerable attention is paid to the social processes by which certain environmental conditions become socially defined as problems. Although there was sometimes acrimonious debate between the constructivist and realist camps within environmental sociology in the 1990s, the two sides have found considerable common ground as both increasingly accept that while most environmental problems have a material reality, they nonetheless become known only via human process such as scientific knowledge, activists' efforts, and media attention. In other words, most environmental problems have a real ontological status despite our awareness of them stemming from social processes by which various conditions are constructed as problems by scientists, activists, media, and other social actors. Correspondingly, environmental problems must all be understood via social processes, despite any material basis they may have external to humans. This interactiveness is now broadly accepted, but many aspects of the debate continue in contemporary research in the field. History. Ancient Greeks idealized life in nature using the idea of the pastoral. Much later, Romantic writers such as Wordsworth took their inspiration from nature. Modern thought surrounding human-environment relations can be traced back to Charles Darwin. Darwin's concept of natural selection suggested that certain social characteristics played a key role in the survivability of groups in the natural environment. Although typically taken at the micro-level, evolutionary principles, particularly adaptability, serve as a microcosm of human ecology. Work by Craig Humphrey and Frederick Butler traces the linkages between Darwin's work on natural selection, human ecological sociology, and environmental sociology. Sociology developed as a scholarly discipline in the mid and late 19th and early 20th centuries, in a context where biological determinism had failed to fully explain key features of social change, including the evolving relationship between humans and the natural environments. In its foundational years, classical sociology thus saw social and cultural factors as the dominant, if not exclusive, cause of social and cultural conditions. This lens downplayed interactive factors in the relationship between humans and biophysical environments. Environmental sociology emerged as a coherent subfield of inquiry after the environmental movement of the 1960s and early 1970s. The works of William Mark Hatton, Jr. and Riley Dunlap, among others, challenged the constricted anthropocentrism of classical sociology. In the late 1970s, they called for a new holistic or systems perspective. Since the 1970s, general sociology has noticeably transformed to include environmental forces in social explanations. Environmental sociology has now solidified as a respected, interdisciplinary field of study in academia. Concepts. Existential dualism. The duality of the human condition rests with cultural uniqueness and evolutionary traits. From one perspective, humans are embedded in the ecosphere and co-evolved alongside other species. Humans share the same basic ecological dependencies as other inhabitants of nature. From the other perspectives, humans are distinguished from other species because of their innovative capacities, distinct cultures and varied institutions. Human creations have the power to independently manipulate, destroy, and transcend the limits of the natural environment. According to Butler, there are 5 basic epistemologies in environmental sociology. In practice, this means 5 different theories of what to blame for environmental degradation, i.e., what to researchers consider as important. In order of their invention, these ideas of what to blame build on each other and thus contradict each other. Neo-Malthusianism. Works such as Hardin's The Tragedy of the Commons reformulated Malthusian thought about abstract population increases causing famines into a model of individual selfishness at larger scales, causing degradation of common pool resources such as the air, water, the oceans, or general environmental conditions. Hardin offered privatization of resources and government regulation as solutions to environmental degradation caused by tragedy of the commons conditions. Many other sociologists shared this view of solutions well into the 1970s. There have been many critiques of this view, particularly political scientist Elinor Ostrom, or economists Amartya Sen and Esther Boserup. Even though much of mainstream journalism considers Malthusianism the only view of environmentalism, most sociologists would disagree with Malthusianism since social organizational issues of environmental degradation are more demonstrated to cause environmental problems than abstract population or selfishness per se. For examples of this critique, Ostrom in her book Governing the Commons, The Evolution of Institutions for Collective Action argues that instead of self-interest always causing degradation, it can sometimes motivate people to take care of the common property resources. To do this they must change the basic organizational rules of resource use. Her research provides evidence for sustainable resource management systems around common pool resources that have lasted for centuries in some areas of the world. Amartya Sen argues in his book Poverty and Famines, an essay on entitlement and deprivation, that population expansion fails to cause famines or degradation as Malthusians and Neo-Malthusians argue. Instead, in documented cases, a lack of political entitlement to resources that exist in abundance causes famines in some populations. He documents how famines can occur even in the midst of plenty or in the context of low populations. He argues that famines would only occur in non-functioning democracies or unrepresentative states. Esther Boserup argues in her book The Conditions of Agricultural Growth, the economics of agrarian change under population pressure from inductive, empirical case analysis that Malthus's more deductive conception of a presumed one-to-one relationship with agricultural scale and population is actually reversed. Instead of agricultural technology and scale determining and limiting population as Malthus attempted to argue, Boserup argued the world is full of cases of the direct opposite. The population changes and expands agricultural methods. Ego-Marxists Collarel and Schneiberg argues against Malthusianism with the rationale that under larger capitalist economies, human degradation moved from a localized, population-based degradation to organizationally caused degradation of capitalist political economies to blame. He gives the example of the organized degradation of rainforest areas which states and capitalists push people off the land before it is degraded by organizational means. Thus, many authors are critical of Malthusianism, from sociologists to economists to political scientists, and all focus on how a country's social organization of its extraction can degrade the environment independent of abstract population. New Ecological Paradigm. In the 1970s, the new ecological paradigm conception critiqued the claimed lack of human environmental focus in the classical sociologists and the sociological priorities the followers created. This was critiqued as the human exceptionalism paradigm. The Hep viewpoint claims that human-environmental relationships were unimportant sociologically because humans are exempt from environmental forces via cultural change. This view was shaped by the leading Western worldview of the time and the desire for sociology to establish itself as an independent discipline, against the then popular racist biological environmental determinism where environment was all. In this Hep view, human dominance was felt to be justified by the uniqueness of culture, argued to be more adaptable than biological traits. Furthermore, culture also has the capacity to accumulate and innovate, making it capable of solving all natural problems. Therefore, as humans were not conceived of as governed by natural conditions, they were felt to have complete control of their own destiny. Any potential limitation posed by the natural world was felt to be surpassed using human ingenuity. Research proceeded accordingly without environmental analysis. In the 1970s, sociological scholars Riley Dunlap and William R. Catton, Jr. began recognizing the limits of what would be termed the human exceptionalism paradigm. Catton and Dunlap suggested a new perspective that took environmental variables into full account. They coined a new theoretical outlook for sociology, the new ecological paradigm, with assumptions contrary to Hep. The NEP recognizes the innovative capacity of humans, but says that humans are still ecologically interdependent as with other species. The NEP notes the power of social and cultural forces but does not profess social determinism. Instead, humans are impacted by the cause, effect, and feedback loops of ecosystems. The Earth has a finite level of natural resources and waste repositories. Thus, the biophysical environment can impose constraints on human activity. They discussed a few harbingers of this NEP in hybridized theorizing about topics that were neither exclusively social nor environmental. Explanations of environmental conditions. It was additionally a critique of Malthusian views of the 1960s and 1970s. Dunlap and Catton's work immediately received a critique from Buttle, who argued to the contrary that classical sociological foundations could be found for environmental sociology, particularly in Weber's work on ancient agrarian civilizations, and Durkheim's view of the division of labor as built on a material premise of specialization in response to material scarcity. This environmental aspect of Durkheim has been discussed by Schneeberg as well. Eco-Marxism. In the middle of the Hep-NEP debate, the general trend of neo-Marxism was occurring. There was cross-pollination. Neo-Marxism was based on the collapse of the widespread believability of the Marxist social movement in the failed revolts of the 1960s and the rise of many new social movements that failed to fit in many Marxist analytic frameworks of conflict sociology. Sociologists entered the fray with empirical research on these novel social conflicts. Neo-Marxism's stress on the relative autonomy of the state from capital control instead of it being only a reflection of economic determinism of class conflict yielded this novel theoretical viewpoint in the 1970s. Neo-Marxist ideas of conflict sociology were applied to capital, state, labor, environmental conflicts instead of only labor, capital, state conflicts. Overproduction. Therefore, some sociologists wanted to stretch Marxist ideas of social conflict to analyze environmental social movements from this materialist framework, instead of interpreting environmental movements as a more cultural, new social movement, separate than material concerns. So, eco-Marxism was based on using neo-Marxist conflict sociology concepts of the relative autonomy of the state applied to environmental conflict. Two people following this school were James O'Connor and later Alan Schneeberg. Later, a different trend developed in eco-Marxism via of the attention brought to the importance of metabolic analysis in Marx's thought by John Bellamy Foster. Contrary to previous assumptions that classical theorists in sociology all had fallen within a human exemptionalist paradigm, Foster argued that Marx's materialism led him to theorize labor as the metabolic process between humanity and the rest of nature. In Promethean interpretations of Marx that Foster critiques, there was an assumption his analysis was very similar to the anthropocentric views critiqued by early environmental sociologists. Instead, Foster argued Marx himself was concerned about the metabolic rift generated by capitalist society's social metabolism, particularly in industrial agriculture. Marx had identified an irreparable rift in the interdependent process of social metabolism, created by capitalist agriculture that was destroying the productivity of the land and creating wastes in urban sites that failed to be reintegrated into the land and thus lead toward destruction of urban workers' health simultaneously. Reviewing the contribution of this thread of eco-Marxism to current environmental sociology, Pellow and Brehm conclude the metabolic rift is a productive development in the field because it connects current research to classical theory and links sociology with an interdisciplinary array of scientific literatures focused on ecosystem dynamics. Foster emphasized that his argument presupposed the magisterial work of Paul Burkitt, who had developed a closely related red-green perspective rooted in a direct examination of Marx's value theory. Burkitt and Foster proceeded to write a number of articles together on Marx's ecological conceptions, reflecting the shared perspective. More recently, Jason W. Moore, inspired by Burkitt's value-analytical approach to Marx's ecology and arguing that Foster's work did not in itself go far enough, has sought to integrate the notion of metabolic rift with world systems theory, incorporating Marx and value-related conceptions. For Moore, the modern world system is a capitalist world ecology, joining the accumulation of capital, the pursuit of power, and the production of nature in dialectical unity. Central to Moore's perspective is a philosophical rereading of Marx's value theory, through which abstract social labor and abstract social nature are dialectically bound. Moore argues that the emergent law of value from the 16th century was evident in the extraordinary shift in the scale, scope, and speed of environmental change. What took pre-modern civilization centuries to achieve, such as the deforestation of Europe in the medieval era, capitalism realized in mere decades. This world historical rupture, argues Moore, can be explained through a law of value that regards labor productivity as the decisive metric of wealth and power in the modern world. For this standpoint, the genius of capitalist development has been to appropriate uncommodified natures, including uncommodified human natures, as a means of advancing labor productivity in the commodity system. Societal Environmental Dialectic. In 1975, the highly influential work of Alan Schneeberg transfigured environmental sociology, proposing a societal environmental dialectic, though within the neo-Marxist framework of the relative autonomy of the state as well. This conflictual concept has overwhelming political salience. First, the economic synthesis states that the desire for economic expansion will prevail over ecological concerns. Policy will decide to maximize immediate economic growth at the expense of environmental disruption. Secondly, the managed scarcity synthesis concludes that governments will attempt to control only the most dire of environmental problems to prevent health and economic disasters. This will give the appearance that governments act more environmentally consciously than they really do. Third, the ecological synthesis generates a hypothetical case where environmental degradation is so severe that political forces would respond with sustainable policies. The driving factor would be economic damage caused by environmental degradation. The economic engine would be based on renewable resources at this point. Production and consumption methods would adhere to sustainability regulations. These conflict-based syntheses have several potential outcomes. One is that the most powerful economic and political forces will preserve the status quo and bolster the dominance. Historically, this is the most common occurrence. Another potential outcome is for contending powerful parties to fall into a stalemate. Lastly, tumultuous social events may result that redistribute economic and political resources. Treadmill of production. In 1980, the highly influential work of Alan Schneeberg entitled The Environment, From Surplus to Scarcity was a large contribution to this theme of a societal environmental dialectic, moving away from economic reductionism like other neo-Marxists. Schneeberg called for an analysis of how certain projects of political capitalism encouraged environmental degradation instead of all capitalism. Per se, this ongoing trend in Marxism of neo-Marxist analysis here added the environmental conditions of abstract additions and withdrawals from the environment as social policies instead of naturalized contexts. Schneeberg's political capitalism, otherwise known as the treadmill of production, is a model of conflict as well as cooperation between three abstracted groups: the state, capital, and labor. He analyzes only the United States at length, though sees such a treadmill of production and of environmental degradation in operation in the Soviet Union and socialist countries as well. The desire for economic expansion was found to be a common political ground for all three contentious groups, in capital, labor, and the state, to surmount the separate interests and postpone conflict by all agreeing on economic growth. Therefore, grounds for a political alliance emerge among these conflictual actors when monopoly capitalism can convince both of the other nodes to support its politicized consolidation. This can appeal to the other nodes since it additionally provides expanding state legitimacy and its own funding while providing secure worker employment in larger industries with the desired stable and growing consumption. This political capitalism works against smaller-scale capitalism or other uses of the state or against other alliances of labor. Schneeberg called the acceleration of the treadmill this degradative political support for monopoly capitalism's expansion. This acceleration, he felt, was at root merely an informal alliance, based solely on the propaganda from monopoly capital and the state that worker consumption can only be achieved through further capitalist consolidation. However, Schneeberg felt that environmental damage caused by state political and labor-supported capitalist expansion may cause a decline both in the state's funding as well as worker livelihood. This provides grounds for both to reject the treadmill alliance with monopoly capital. This would mean severing organized labor support and state policy support of monopoly capital's desires of consolidation. Schneeberg is motivated to optimism by this potential if states and labor movements can be educated to the environmental and livelihood dangers in the long run of any support of monopoly capital. This potentially means these two groups moving away from subsidizing and supporting the degradation of the environment. Schneeberg pins his hopes for environmental improvement on deceleration of the treadmill, how mounting environmental degradation might yield a breakdown in the acceleration-based Treadmill alliance. This deceleration was defined as state and working labor movements designing policies to shrink the scale of the economy as a solution to environmental degradation and their own consumptive requirements. Meanwhile, in the interim, he argued a common alliance between the three is responsible for why they prefer to support common economic growth as a common way to avoid their open conflicts despite mounting environmental costs from the state as well as for laborers due to environmental disruption. Ecological modernization and reflexive modernization. By the 1980s, a critique of eco-Marxism was in the offing, given empirical data from countries that were attempting to wed environmental protection with economic growth instead of seeing them as separate. This was done through both state and capital restructuring. Major proponents of this school of research are Arthur P. J. Moll and Gert Spoor-Agren. Popular examples of ecological modernization would be cradle-to-cradle production cycles, industrial ecology, large-scale organic agriculture, biomimicry, permaculture, agroecology and certain strands of sustainable development, all implying that economic growth is possible if that growth is well organized with the environment in mind. Reflexive modernization. The many volumes of the German sociologist Ulrich Beck first argued from the late 1980s that our risk society is potentially being transformed by the environmental social movements of the world into a structural change without rejecting the benefits of modernization and industrialization. This is leading to a form of reflexive modernization with a world of reduced risk and better modernization process in economics, politics, and scientific practices as they are made less beholden to a cycle of protecting risk from correction. Politics creates eco-disasters, then claims responsibility in an accident, yet nothing remains corrected because it challenges the very structure of the operation of the economy and the private dominance of development. For example, Beck's idea of a reflexive modernization looks forward to how our ecological and social crises in the late 20th century are leading toward transformations of the whole political and economic systems institutions, making them more rational with ecology in mind. Social construction of the environment. Additionally, in the 1980s, with the rise of postmodernism in the Western Academy and the appreciation of discourse as a form of power, some sociologists turned to analyzing environmental claims as a form of social construction more than their material requirement. Proponents of this school include John A. Hannigan, particularly in environmental sociology, a social constructionist perspective. Hannigan argues for a soft constructionism over a hard constructionism.